Hi everybody. So for this devlog, I worked on some of the game mechanics. So I worked on looting, inventory, and banking. So just to show some of the new features. Also, you'll see I don't have a sword anymore, just this punch animation, which is actually kind of hard to land sometimes. So if I sort of one punch man that, we can see now this F pops up. This is the interaction key. I have an interaction system now, which allows me to add any interactions to any entities in the game. So in this case, this would be a dead orcs interaction. Also, you can see the particles emitting that show that there is some loot to be had. And in this case, it drops a rusty ass sword, and it shows the orc loot. So whatever died shows what it was. And this panel will grow dynamically with the number of items that are looted. This won't work very well if we have monsters that loot like a lot of stuff, or drop a lot of loot, I should say, but it works fine for now since they only drop a few things. And then we can loot all this. Also, there's stackable items. So the nature elements and coins are stackable. A bit of extra code there to get it to stack properly and work, but yeah, it ends up being okay. So we have coins, nature elements, and you'll see the inventory filling up. And eventually, these guys are going to kill me. And I'll go into sort of a ghost mode, which will let me work without them bothering me too much. Okay, so I think they may have killed me. And you can see, picked up plenty of swords, and these items were stacked. So these are all dead. If I go now to the bank, which is called the loot hole, which I sort of missed an opportunity here to add something inside of it, but maybe I'll do that in the future. This also has an interaction. So if you go inside of it, you'll see the F key pop up. So I open up, and it is the bank. And you can bank these items, and these will all stack. And behind the scenes, the bank keeps track of all the loot IDs and all that good stuff. So you can pull them out, and yeah, it'll keep track of all of that. And you can also pull out the stacks. I don't have a way to pull out X number of items or anything like that. I didn't think that was necessary at this point. But yeah, that's the bank, and quite a bit of code to wire up the server's interactions and syncing with the client. But I'll go over that in a little bit. So let's say you pull out all your items or some of your items, and then you're just sitting here, and then another player logs in. This player can see that there are a lot of dead orcs and things around. So he's going to start looking for another player, and he sees you off in the corner. And unfortunately, you're AFK. You're not in a safe zone, and he's going to one punch man you as well. And you can see that now the player is dropping loot as well. So you have the particle system that's showing that there's loot to be had, and you can loot all the loot that we saw previously into this player, and this player shows it in their inventory. They can go into the bank and they can drop off the loot. So this kind of gives an idea of what I would eventually like to get to as far as the game mechanics go, where you can kill other players, pick up their loot, sort of like a hardcore PvP system. And I think that pretty much wraps it up for this part. For this next part, I'm going to show some of the code and not all the intricate pieces to get this built, but just some of the main points, as I think it'll be helpful for the next example. So this is the game server, and the first thing I did was add a fiddler, and a fiddler is just another thread that has some responsibility for the game server. And currently it's a thread, but it could be running on a process on a different machine someday, but for now it's just another thread. And the responsibility for the loot fiddler here is to manage all of the state of the loot in the game. So the inventory, the bank, and also generating loot. So in this case, it's listening for loot events, and this generate drop loot comes from the simulation fiddler, which is responsible for managing the interactions between players and NPCs. And when an NPC gets killed by a player, this event will be created and sent to the loot fiddler, and it'll use a drop table to determine what loot should be given to the player. And the drop table is probably the most interesting part of this. So I tried to write the drop table in the most intuitive way I could think of at the time. So I kind of followed, if you ever played a game like RuneScape, where you have a drop table where you have like a 1 in 1,000 chance to get some specific item, that probability should be incorporated in some way, it shouldn't just be purely random. And I did that by using a weighted index. And I think this works well. So this is just initializing the table based on the NPC type. And when we actually want to calculate loot, pretty straightforward. We just grab the drop table entry for that NPC type. So in this example, it could be an orc. And then it figures out how much loot to get. You can tell this +1 here always drops something for now. And the loot table, it'll figure out what loot to get. Simply check if it's already been given that loot in this calculation. And then if it has a range, it'll figure out within the minimax of that range how much to give. So if it's coins and it's 0 to 10 for this orc, yeah, it'll randomly grab a number between 0 and 10. So this will generate the loot, and as you can see here, it gets a new ID. So it's a brand new piece of loot into the game from this drop loot table. And from here, we have inventories. So once the loot is generated, it goes into this temp loop queue, and then when it goes off to the client selects it, it comes back that it's been selected, and then it gets added to an inventory. And the interesting part about this is for stacked loot, this line here, I throw away the loot ID and I just use the first loot ID for that stackable item. Don't know if it's the best way to do it, but I think it's okay for now. And then you have banks. And banks are very similar, except they're based on the actual loot type. So each loot type has bank slot, and the bank slot will then maintain all of the proper loot IDs. Now looking at the client code, I added quite a few things to get this all working, but some of the more interesting things are I added a few more entity component systems. So I have the UI system, the interaction system, and the loot system. I also added a way for systems to communicate with each other because I didn't previously need that. So if you look at system messages here, it's just a queue basically, and this retain call peels off different messages for the systems that need them. So in this case, if you look at UI show interaction icon, this is set in the interaction system here. This happens after the interaction system goes to the interaction components and finds that the player is inside the zone of interaction component. It then adds that message to the queue. It gets picked up here, probably next frame, and it shows the interaction icon, which is that F icon. And I also added the loot system, which does what you would think. As loot comes in, it parses out the loot and it adds the particles and the interaction components for each orc that dies. Orc in this case could be any NPC. It also does something interesting, which I added, which is action acknowledgements. So when I actually pick up loot, I send it to the server that this loot was picked up. The server will verify that that loot could be picked up by that player, and then it will acknowledge that player action. And it has some logic where if the packet is dropped, then on the next snapshot, it'll also add it again until it sees that a snapshot was acknowledged that included that action. So in this case, this is an acknowledgement for picking up loot, which basically is when you click on the loot panel and you click on a loot item, and then it will remove it from this temporary loot in transit, which if we look here, it will remove the loot from the loot component. If the loot component is empty, then it removes the particles and it shuts down the UI panel by adding another one of those messages to the queue for the UI system to pick up, or it just has it remove that specific UI element, which would be the button and the tile. So that's pretty much it for the coding part. Again, there's quite a few pieces that plumb everything together, but that's sort of the high level overview of what was added. But here's just a general example, and we'll start with the easy part first. This is the server, this is the client. We have coming from the server, the players acknowledged actions and the loot, and then from the client it's just the player actions. For example, action could be picked up loot, whatever the case. And between these two, I mean, it's currently on my LAN, but between these two could be the internet eventually one day. So as we drill down into the logic of the server for this example, we start off with the simulation fiddler, and we start off with an NPC dying to a player. So it'll also work for a player, but we'll start with the NPC. And take note that for the NPC to die, there's actually quite a bit that happens before that. For example, the physics fiddler calculates the collision detection, and the simulation fiddler figures out how much damage to apply, all that good stuff. So once there is a death of an NPC from the player, or a player I should say, since this is multiplayer, the first thing is the simulation fiddler will send a loot event that we need some drop loot. And then the loot fiddler will pick that up, and it will work with the loot table here, and it will create the loot and it will insert it into a temporary loot table. And from there, the next step is it will send to the main thread that we need to add loot. This will include the loot that was created, and this will get packaged, which is this step here. And then it will get sent off to the client. That was that first piece that we saw, that was loot. Then the client will do its job and will receive a client update. And this will make sense once I show the client. That will get sent as another event that will get created, which is a pickup loot, which just lets the loot fiddler know that the loot was received, and it will get inserted into the inventory. And this pattern is similar for transferring from inventory to bank and bank to inventory, things like that. The final piece to this is what happens on the client. So the first step is the loot system. This is where it starts. We'll be parsing for new loot that comes in. And when it gets new loot, it will add an interaction and a particle system to the entity. These are in forms of components. And it also, at the same time, will send an update message to the loot panel to update that specific part of its GUI. And then the interaction system here This will be monitoring the player's position, and whenever the player is in range of that interaction, then it will send a message to show the interaction icon. And let's say the player clicks the icon, then it'll send another message to show loot, which then the UI system will display those pieces of its GUI. If the loot is then selected by the player, then we send a loot selected message back to the loot system, which will then create the player action, which we saw in the first piece of this, and send it to the server. The server will then handle that, and it will send up an acknowledgement. This goes back as another message to update the panel again. That update will actually remove the loot. If there's no loot left at all, it will also close the window. But generally speaking, if there's loot, it will just remove that item of loot. And it will also, which I didn't put here, it also updates the inventory panel, but it's not super relevant to this example. And that's pretty much it. That's how we make a round trip. We generate the loot, send it to the client, and acknowledge it back on the server. And if you made it this far, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Take care.